I'm Dr. Maiko Kawabata, and I work at the Open University and the Royal College of Music. And today I'm going to present my research on the new Yellow Peril in Western European symphony orchestras. I'm a classically trained violinist of Japanese ethnicity with wide experience as a professional freelancer in orchestras throughout the UK and Germany. Over the years, in informal conversations with colleagues and friends, I came to realize that there were certain commonalities of lived experience shared by orchestral musicians who look like me, who self-identify as being of East Asian descent. For sure, we're an elite group. We enjoy the privilege of performing the orchestral repertoire that we love, music that epitomizes a certain aesthetic tradition and is of the highest cultural prestige. We've invested our lives and resources into acquiring musical instruments, music lessons, and instrumental proficiency, and into acculturation, or one could say assimilation, to a specific orchestral habitus, to use Pierre Bourdieu's term. Many have achieved a high degree of professional success, as evidenced by the fact that today more East Asians populate European orchestras than ever before. At the same time, within my personal network, it became apparent through accumulating accounts that minoritizing racialization was happening in manifold aspects of our profession. I began to recognize that there was an uneasy tension for many of us caused by the positive affirmation of our identity as performers of Western classical music, alongside the othering that marked us as different. This project thus found me, not the other way around. And it was from these beginnings that I went on to conduct an empirical study to investigate the question. To what extent are the experiences of East Asians in Western European orchestras racialized? Through a total of 35 unstructured interviews in 2019 to 2020, I documented experiences of racialized identity and gendered identity in aspects of orchestral playing ranging from training to auditions, trials, rehearsals, concerts, and tours. My sample pool grew as news of my project spread by word of mouth. Here you can see the gender breakdown, age range, locations, and instruments represented, with stringed instruments comprising the majority. In terms of method, my model was analytic autoethnography, whereby the researcher is numbered among the research subjects, and which relies on analytic self-reflexivity. I was always positioned not as an external researcher, but rather as an insider. Indeed, it's not clear to me how this study could have come about in any other way. In terms of research ethics, I obtained verbal consent to publish what interviewees told me. All spoke to me under cover of anonymity. I should mention here that 5 musicians I approached declined to be interviewed, saying that they had no race-specific experiences, that they couldn't be sure and did not wish to speculate, or without stating a reason. Overall, the interviews revealed racialized experiences coalescing around 5 main themes. In the interest of time, I will condense discussion of these themes and limit the number of quotations from my interviewees, which you can find in the longer version of this paper. Number 1, the orchestral application process is biased against East Asians. 9 interviewees had sent out resumes that they explained were comparable to those of white colleagues and classmates, but didn't receive invitations to audition, even as others received theirs. A violinist who knew that her CV was identical to that of a white friend with a German-sounding name noted that, quote, "She was being invited left and right, and I didn't get invited anywhere," end quote. Nearly all cases happened in the German system, where the application process doesn't automatically pre-select citizens and residents, as for instance the British system does. When a person submits a CV and seeks an audition invitation, their name is apparent on their CV, and sometimes they need to submit a photo. In other words, indirect racialized modes of evaluation are built into the system. Number 2, orchestral applications bearing East Asian names are deselected. 5 interviewees reported orchestras passing over East Asian names in the selection process, saying things like, quote, "Sometimes they just see 30 Lees or Kims in a row and don't read them," end quote. Women who acquired European surnames upon marriage found that they suddenly received more invitations. We know these things happen because friends and colleagues in orchestras tell us so. Number 3, orchestral auditions are biased against East Asians. 10 out of 35 interviewees, almost 1 out of every 3, reported discrimination at screenless auditions. After passing the screened first round, they lost the unscreened second round to white Europeans. A male violinist recalled leading, quote, "by a clear margin of points," end quote, at the first screened round of a concertmaster audition. After the second round, which was unscreened, he was eliminated despite having played just as well. While discrimination affects both genders, more women reported that they were criticized for their looks, their height, or their lack of personality. East Asian women, particularly those who play larger instruments, report being ridiculed for their diminutive stature during their auditions. Though racism at auditions can range from blatant to implied, it strikes most obviously when screens are removed. Number 4, East Asians experience racism in orchestral rehearsals and beyond. 13 interviewees reported a range of racist behaviors from orchestral and managerial colleagues. For example, being addressed by the racial slur Schlitzaugen, the German term for slit eyes. Some female interviewees reported co-constituting sexism and racism in the form of harassment from older white men in positions of authority in professional settings. There were also microaggressions, such as being denied certain perks of the job afforded to others in the same position, assumptions that we don't speak the language, or being mistaken for one another. On this last point, when East Asians are reduced to our phenotype and seen as indistinguishable from one another while making music, it's particularly problematic since it denies us our individuality in a field where individual expression is paramount. Though this may sometimes happen unintentionally, often white colleagues view cases of mistaken identity as funny rather than offensive. Number 5, East Asians are branded quote-unquote automatons. 6 interviewees reported hearing the racist stereotype that East Asians are so-called automatons, technically proficient but expressionless or soulless. A violinist who sought feedback after auditions said, quote, "More than once I heard the comment with the undertone of, quote, 'You Asians are always so perfect, but I didn't feel it,' end quote." 3 interviewees deliberately compensated for the automaton stereotype by playing with larger physical gestures and/or exaggerating facial expressions to telegraph emotion. On some occasions, they felt pushed into making choices that did not necessarily come naturally to them. So deeply had the bias been internalized. In summary, 25 out of 35 musicians, roughly 70%, reported negative experiences of racialization in one or more of these 5 ways. The breakdowns in terms of gender and country are shown here. Of the remaining 10, 7 had no such personal experience themselves, but had witnessed racism. 2 had not witnessed anything of the sort, and 1 was unsure if they'd witnessed anything. To sum up my study, there's significant evidence that East Asian orchestral players in parts of Europe do experience racism in every aspect of the profession. East Asians are excluded from applying, held to different standards of performance, and marked as less than. There is a term for anti-Asian racism of this kind. The Yellow Peril refers to the racist phobia of invasion by foreigners, specifically East Asians. Over centuries, this has manifested at times of perceived threat to the power of the West, whether that be colonial power, economic power, or cultural power, as documented in Chen and Yates's book, which you can see here. Today, East Asian orchestral players in parts of Europe are the new Yellow Peril. Consider this cartoon from 1989 of the Vienna Philharmonic, a textbook image of Yellow Peril. It portrays an invasion of the Musikverein, home to the famous New Year's concert, using stereotypical imagery. Titled Gruß aus Wien, or Greeting from Vienna, this image originally appeared alongside an article bemoaning the unwelcome prospect of Austrian orchestras being overrun by what the article calls internationally trained instrumental acrobats. A few years later, the Austrian music sociologist Elena Ostleitner observed in the Viennese musical elites what she called, quote, the fear of a foreigner invasion, end quote. With this term, Ausländerinvasion, she evoked the rhetoric of the Yellow Peril that this image exemplifies. The Vienna Philharmonic has the dubious honor of being the only European orchestra known to have withheld a vacant position following screened auditions upon discovering that the successful candidate was East Asian. While this is by far the most shocking example, there's plenty of other evidence confirming that the lived experiences of my interviewees are not isolated. For instance, when East Asian or Asian American soloists such as Young Uk Kim and Jennifer Ko come to perform in Europe and are asked things like, quote, as an Oriental, how can you understand Mozart or Brahms, end quote. Such comments expose a hypocrisy, namely, that Western classical music is a universal language, yet belongs to white Europeans. The myth of this music as an international language and its false claims to universality have recently been addressed by Grace Wang and Mari Yoshihara, as well as Mina Yang and, most recently, Kira Thurman. According to the self-conferred logic of cultural ownership, only Europeans can truly understand and therefore give authentic expression to the music of Mozart or Brahms. Some white Europeans seem to believe that only white European performers have this so-called authenticity. So, of course, the musical performance of any phenotypical outsider will be considered inauthentic, even before the first note is played, whether we are yellow, black, or brown-skinned. The roots of racial prejudice can thus be traced, arguably, to the very ideological foundations of Western classical music. The problems of structural inequality I observe in orchestras is a problem I identified in Western classical music institutions more broadly by a number of scholars in recent years. The racialization of Western classical music as a genre of whiteness, as a genre of white normativity, as a genre of systemic whiteness, as a genre of white supremacy even, is gaining increasing recognition thanks to the groundbreaking work of William Cheng, Juliet Hess, Taru Lepenin, Christina Scharf, and Lauren Kajikawa. The prevalence of anti-Asian racism in the orchestral sector I'm highlighting today seems to point to the same structural problems of inequality and Eurocentrism that they identify. One quick example of this is the Festspielhaus Baden-Baden's advertising campaign of 2004 for their performance of Wagner's Parsifal, conducted by Kent Nagano. The publicity poster depicts the composer making slanty eyes in reference to the Japanese-American conductor. Not only did it find its way to billboards, it actually won the 2006 Golden Nail Prize awarded by the Art Directors Club, a media consortium based in Berlin. The poster thus illustrates not only a racist trope, but a culture that normalizes racism. The Festspielhaus declined to comment when I approached them, except to state that they have since changed management and that they now wish to distance themselves from the poster. The obvious question here is what can be done about the situation, how to change things for the better, to foster inclusion, equality, and diversity in meaningful and lasting ways. In terms of ways forward, then, First, there's an urgent need, in my opinion, for a comprehensive revamping of the ways European orchestras recruit and audition new members. Specifically, all applications should be anonymized, and screened auditions should be standard for all rounds, not just the first round. And not because such auditions are ideal or should be permanent, but because they provide emergency equity in the absence of a level playing field. Second, support should be available for East Asian musicians from orchestras and conservatoires to help musicians navigate the process of preparing for orchestral positions, along the lines of Chinekei's European Alliance for Audition Support, which mentors and finances young musicians from ethnic minorities to audition for orchestras. But these are only stopgap measures, in that they do little to change or challenge the culture of orchestras or the ideological underpinnings of orchestral music. While creating pathways to increase minority orchestral membership is a way to work towards greater inclusivity, it still doesn't address the underlying problem, namely the overrepresentation of whiteness in orchestras and in orchestral culture. Actually, it's questionable how ethical it is to simply bring minorities into white spaces while minoritizing violence continues unchecked and unabated. What is needed now is nothing short of structural transformation, an overhaul of the entire system. Jennifer Koh, the violinist I mentioned earlier, has advocated for giving agency to Asian Americans not only as performers, but also as composers, administrators, and board members of arts organizations. Her message of empowerment ought to apply to East Asians settled in Europe, while of course being mindful of the cultural and historical differences in patterns of immigrations and expatriation between Europe and the US. Like Koh's anti-racism, recent initiatives by activists inspire the hope that activism can bring about change. Because ultimately, what East Asian musicians want is equality of opportunity and inclusion, which in my view can only meaningfully emerge from addressing existing inequality and exclusion, and which can potentially lead to orchestral transformation.